They say the Mississippi River keeps secrets better than any confessor, but on that heavy, humid night in August 1847, even its mighty current could not hide what unfolded on the Bogard plantation outside Baton Rouge. The event began with whispers, but by morning, 23 witnesses swore they had seen something that defied explanation. At precisely 3:00 a.m., Mrs. Charlotte Bogard, wife of Louisiana State Senator Theodore Bogard, was carried out from the slave quarters, her white nightgown soaked in something darker than mud, her eyes hollow and vacant, as though her soul had been drained. Within 2 days, the sheriff's official record of the incident vanished from the parish archives. The priest who was called to the plantation refused to speak of what he saw until his dying breath 40 years later, and every enslaved person present that night was sold and scattered across the South within a week. To the people of Baton Rouge, the incident was quietly forgotten, absorbed into the silences that built the Old South. But for those who still spoke of it in hushed tones, what happened that night was not a tragedy, it was an awakening. The Bogard plantation, one of the grandest estates in East Baton Rouge Parish, stood like a monument to Southern prosperity. Its master, Senator Theodore Bogard, owned nearly 3,000 acres of sugarcane fields, 137 enslaved laborers, and one of the most productive sugar mills in the region. His influence stretched far beyond his property. His voice in the state Senate could sway laws about trade, transportation, and the increasingly brutal slave codes that governed the state. His wife, Charlotte, was the fascination of Baton Rouge society. 20 years younger than her husband, she had arrived from Charleston with an education uncommon for women of her time. She spoke French and Latin fluently, and curiously, several West African dialects she claimed to have learned from her childhood nurse. Her intelligence was magnetic, her manner both elegant and mysterious. While other women filled their time with gossip and embroidery, Charlotte spent her evenings reading medical treatises and histories of the ancient world. Guests were captivated and occasionally unsettled by her conversation. The Bogard home itself was an architectural wonder, a white-columned mansion gleaming like bleached bone against the Louisiana sun. But its grounds held darker corners. The layout of the plantation was peculiar. The slave quarters formed a horseshoe shape, enclosing a larger structure at the center known as the keeping house. Officially, it was a space where the sick were treated and childbirths were attended, but among the enslaved, it was whispered about with dread. They called it the place where spirits gathered, a place of transition between the living and the dead. Among the enslaved was a woman named Marie Claire, listed in the plantation ledgers simply as Mary, housemaid, age 30. Intelligent and quiet, Marie could read and write, a dangerous gift for a woman in bondage. She served as Charlotte's personal maid, moving silently through her mistress's daily life, observing everything and revealing nothing. The summer of 1847 was brutal, a season when the air itself seemed to weigh on the body. A strange fever had swept through both enslaved and white populations, killing 7 people in July alone. The parish doctor, Josiah Henley, called it a new strain of yellow fever, though in private letters he confessed he had never seen anything like it. It was during this oppressive season that Charlotte's behavior began to change. She wandered the plantation at dusk, often toward the quarters, claiming she was distributing medicine. Her husband dismissed it as charitable duty, a mark of her good heart, unaware of how far she was straying from the world of polite society. On August 15, 1847, the Bogards hosted a dinner party for several politicians and planters. The men drank brandy and discussed the coming legislative session, while Charlotte excused herself early, complaining of a headache. Hours later, her maid saw her pacing, whispering in an unknown tongue, before dismissing the servant for the night, an act she had never done before. What happened next is pieced together from testimony and rumor. The overseer claimed he saw Charlotte walking toward the quarters in her nightgown, carrying a leather satchel. When he called out, she did not answer. She moved, he said, as though pulled by invisible strings. By midnight, the keeping house glowed faintly from within. Those who dared to look swore they heard chanting not Christian hymns, but something older, deeper. At 3:00 a.m., the singing ceased, followed by a scream that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Moments later, Charlotte staggered from the building, her nightgown marked with symbols that looked like writing. She collapsed before witnesses could reach her. What followed the disappearance of records, the sale of witnesses, and the silence of the church became one of the darkest secrets Louisiana ever buried. That night did not end a story. It began a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of the South and reveal that some debts written in blood are remembered not by men, but by the land itself. The morning after that terrible night rose bright and golden over the sugar fields of Louisiana, as if the earth itself sought to deny what had happened beneath its humid sky. Yet beneath the calm surface, something fundamental had shifted. Baton Rouge in 1847 was a city divided between past and future. The new state capital still carried the perfume of ambition and decay. Steamboats chugged along the Mississippi carrying sugar, cotton, and the bodies of enslaved men and women whose labor built the wealth of men like Senator Theodore Bogard. His influence stretched across the state. His plantations were among the most productive. His word in the Senate enough to shape laws that deepened the cruelty of the system he profited from. But now the grandeur of the Bogard estate felt hollow, like the echo of something rotting beneath polished marble. Charlotte Bogard, once the bright jewel of Baton Rouge society, lay in her bed feverish and incoherent. The doctor, Josiah Henley, arrived at dawn and recorded symptoms that defied science. Her temperature rose and fell without pattern. Her skin bloomed with dark markings that seemed to appear from within rather than upon her flesh. And her voice, steady and relentless, spoke words that no one could recognize. She spoke without pause for 3 days in a language no one knew. Her husband stayed beside her, alternating between rage and despair, insisting that what had happened in the quarters must never be spoken of again. By the week's end, every enslaved person who had been near the keeping house that night was sold and scattered across other states. The building itself was set aflame, and its ashes were blamed on an accident, though those who had seen the blaze swore that the flames burned cold and white, producing no heat. The sheriff closed the file. The priest fell into silence. But the rumors spread among the enslaved people who remained. They whispered that Mrs. Charlotte had been learning strange things long before that night, that an old woman from Haiti known as Mama Shara had taught her secrets of the land and sky, the ways of spirits that predated the coming of Christ. Mama Shara had died 2 weeks before the night of the screams, lying down calmly in her cabin and announcing that her time had come. Charlotte had been with her when she died, the only white person the old woman had ever allowed into her presence. Father Lair, the parish priest, left a single letter hidden from the public, later found in the Vatican archives. In it, he wrote that Charlotte spoke names that should never be spoken, the true names of angels lost to Scripture, the songs of creation that existed before the flood, and knowledge sealed in church vaults thousands of miles away. The old gods never left, she told him when he pressed her for an explanation. They simply learned to wear new faces. The church quickly silenced him, sending him to a distant parish, but the words he wrote haunted the few who ever read them. Charlotte recovered miraculously within 2 weeks, claiming no memory of the event. She returned to her place in society as if nothing had occurred, attending teas, hosting gatherings, smiling at her husband's colleagues. Yet, those who looked closely saw the change. Her gaze lingered too long on empty spaces. Her fingers traced invisible symbols in the air when she thought she was alone, and she refused to walk near the ruins of the keeping house. Theodore buried himself in politics, becoming louder and more ruthless in his campaigns for control over the enslaved population. He introduced new laws forbidding gatherings, songs, or rituals among the enslaved, laws he justified as measures of safety, but which were really born of fear of the power he had glimpsed, but could not comprehend. 3 months later, a man calling himself Professor Augustus Brenner arrived from Harvard, drawn by whispers of what had taken place. He posed as a scholar of agriculture, but asked questions that made planters uneasy. He learned of Charlotte's life before marriage, her missing years in Paris, her connection to a Haitian scholar who vanished along with a library of forbidden texts. He followed the trail to drunken overseers and terrified servants, collecting fragments of a truth no one wanted told. One overseer confessed before dying in agony that Charlotte had carried something in her satchel, that night, something alive, something that moved as if it were made from pieces of the night itself. Brenner eventually found Marie Claire hiding among free people of color in New Orleans. She told him that Charlotte had been preparing the ritual for months, gathering soil, water, and personal tokens from every enslaved person she would summon that night. She said Charlotte knew their real names, the names their mothers had whispered to them as infants, the names stolen from them by slave traders. She said the land was sick. Marie told him that the old circle was broken and needed to be made whole. And then she added, in a voice trembling with memory, the fever stopped after that night. Not one more person died. Whatever Charlotte had done in the keeping house, it had worked, though no one could say what price had been paid. Yet peace did not return to the Bogard home. Theodore's sleep was plagued by voices that spoke through him in languages unknown. Scratches appeared on his arms that no one could explain. Servants heard strange singing in the fields at night, where the keeping house had once stood. The songs rose and fell in the old rhythms, the ones that carried the weight of lost ancestors. Some nights, people swore they saw Charlotte walking among the rows of cane and magnolia, her figure illuminated by moonlight, though at that same moment she was seated in her parlor, speaking quietly with guests. Whispers grew that she was more than one person now, that something had followed her back from that night of fire and chanting, something the land itself refused to forget. By December of that same year, whatever had taken root in the Bogard household had begun to bloom into something unholy. The air around the plantation felt charged, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Charlotte moved through the days with an eerie serenity, smiling politely at visitors and attending church as though her life had returned to order. Yet servants whispered that at night she sat for hours by her window, eyes fixed toward the ruins of the keeping house, her lips moving soundlessly. Theodore, meanwhile, was unraveling. His once commanding voice had grown hoarse from sleeplessness, and his journals filled with frantic, overlapping handwriting in Latin, English, and symbols that no scholar could translate. His valet spoke of nights when the senator would wake screaming in voices, not his own, the voice of an old Creole woman, of a sobbing child, even of several people speaking at once through his throat. The scratches that appeared on his body deepened, curling into shapes that looked like letters, though not of any known alphabet. Charlotte tended to him with calm devotion, whispering strange lullabies that lulled him into a death-like sleep lasting exactly 12 hours. During those long nights, frost formed on their windows, though the Louisiana winter was far too mild for ice. In the fields, newly purchased slaves began refusing to work near the ruins, claiming the soil there pulsed with warmth, and that at dusk they could hear soft singing rising from the ground. The overseers dismissed it as superstition until their own tools began shifting places overnight, and animals grew restless, kicking at empty air. The townsfolk whispered that the Bogards had brought something back with them, something that moved unseen through the cane rows. Then, in mid-December, an old woman appeared at the plantation gates. She called herself Madame Celeste Arsenault, claiming kinship with Charlotte through distant Creole bloodlines. She was frail yet commanding, her voice a whisper that carried effortlessly through the air. Theodore, desperate for help, welcomed her without hesitation, though Charlotte seemed not to recognize her. The household staff feared her instantly. She wore black from head to toe and asked for peculiar things: soil from 7 points of the property, water drawn at the new moon, and blood from every living soul on the land, enslaved or free. Theodore obeyed, consumed by an inexplicable reverence, forcing the overseer to comply. Over 3 nights, the old woman moved through the house like a shadow, collecting her materials with careful ritual. Those who looked into her veiled face swore they saw not their own reflection, but flickering visions of long, dead ancestors staring back. By the week's end, lamps across the plantation began to burn with greenish flames, casting shadows that seemed to breathe and twist against the walls. The dogs refused to enter the main house, howling until they went hoarse. On the 18th of December, Professor Brenner attempted to visit again, driven by the conviction that the Boggards were part of a greater pattern. Yet the moment his carriage crossed the property line, the horses reared and bolted, their eyes wild with terror. When he tried to approach on foot, a crushing dread seized him. He fell unconscious, muttering about a child growing fat on borrowed time. That same night, every flame across the plantation flickered to that same sickly green, and those who remained claimed to see shadows gathering in corners, watching with patient hunger. Marie Claire, who had returned secretly to spy and understand what Charlotte was doing, saw her former mistress walking toward the family cemetery with Madame Arsenault. The 2 women dug with their bare hands at the grave of Charlotte's infant sister, dead decades before Charlotte's birth, and unearthed something small and wrapped in decayed cloth that glistened wetly in the moonlight. They carried it back to the house with the reverence of priests bearing a relic, taking it to Charlotte's bedroom where Theodore waited in tears, whispering again and again, "The circle turns, the debt is paid, the child comes home." Days later, Charlotte announced she was pregnant, not continuing a pregnancy, but newly conceived, insisting that conception had occurred at dawn that very morning. Dr. Henley, appalled, could not reconcile this claim with the evidence of an already advanced gestation. "The seed was planted when the sun touched the earth," Charlotte said dreamily. "9 days it will grow, 9 nights it will gather, and on the 9th hour of the 10th day it will crown." The date she described was December 29th, the day when ancient traditions marked the thinning of the veil between worlds. As the days passed, servants fled the estate, some claiming to see Charlotte's reflection move in mirrors after she had left the room, others waking to find symbols drawn on their doors in dried blood. Those who stayed only did so out of loyalty or fear. The animals began to die: roosters, pigs, and horses, all collapsing in ritual patterns that defied reason. Theodore stopped eating, claiming that meat tasted of graves, and the frost on the windows thickened even when the hearth burned all night. As Christmas approached, Madame Arsenault declared that the vessel, meaning Charlotte, was ready. The mirrors in her chamber were covered with black cloth, the windows sealed with wax and earth, and circles of ash and bone dust were drawn on the floor. For hours each day, Charlotte sat motionless within those circles as the old woman chanted in a language that made listeners tremble. Some heard many voices speaking through her at once, a chorus of wind and grief. Theodore no longer slept at all. He filled journals with impossible diagrams, buildings that could not exist, shapes that bent space, annotations about load, bearing sorrows, and foundations of grief. The last animal to die was his favorite horse, its body twisted as though bowing to something unseen. That night, Charlotte disappeared from her locked room, leaving behind only symbols burned into the walls and a circular void where the floor should have been a hole so black that light itself seemed to bend toward it. Theodore fell to his knees before it, reaching into the darkness as his wife's voice echoed up, multiplied and layered, whispering, "The payment comes due, the circle completes. The child rises from the foundation of sorrow." When the household came running, they found him babbling of bringing her back from beyond time, while Madame Arsenault stood calmly in the doorway, her veil fallen away to reveal not one face but many shifting faces, old and young, all speaking in a single voice. "It is time. The vessel has descended to gather what was scattered. She will return with the payment required. A search party was hastily gathered as fear swept through every corner of the Bogard plantation. But even the bravest among the men hesitated when they learned that Charlotte had last been seen near the ruins of the keeping house. Those who joined Theodore included Dr. Henley, Judge Treadwell, and 4 overseers armed with crosses, lanterns, and weapons that suddenly seemed childish in the face of what they expected to find. They followed the trail of footprints through the moonlit fields, and even in the dim glow they could see something was wrong. Each footprint seemed to contain several others, smaller and larger, overlapping a child's, a woman's, an old crone's, as if every age of Charlotte's life was walking beside itself in a single stride. The path led directly to the burned foundation of the keeping house, the site that had haunted the plantation since August. There, in the center of the ashen circle, sat Charlotte. Her white nightgown, the same she had worn on the night of the first incident, billowed around her like a shroud, its fabric stained with strange markings that pulsed faintly in the flickering light. She was not alone. Around her, shadows had taken shape, not vague silhouettes, but distinct figures that the men recognized in horror. They saw the forms of the enslaved who had been sold away after the August night, standing silently in the same positions they had once occupied in the keeping house, their outlines wavering like heat mirages. They saw others too, the ghosts of those who had died in the fever, and darker shapes that seemed older than human memory, beings with forms that twisted against logic, suggesting faces yet not faces, eyes without pupils, mouths that did not open yet breathed. Charlotte was speaking to them in a cadence that felt more like music than language, and the shadows responded with movements that carved luminous patterns into the air. When she gestured, they shifted like water, merging and separating in a dance that made the onlookers dizzy. Theodore called out to her, his voice breaking, but she showed no sign of hearing him. Her eyes were rolled completely white, yet every movement of her hands seemed purposeful, guided by some invisible rhythm. From beside her, she lifted the same leather satchel she had carried that first night and began withdrawing objects one by one. First came vials of blood, the same that Madame Arsenault had demanded from every living person on the plantation. She uncorked each vial and poured its contents into the ground at specific points within the circle. With every drop that touched the ash, one of the shadowed figures became clearer, almost solid, until the men could see faces they recognized, their expressions serene and mournful. Next she drew out the soil samples, scattering them in intricate constellations that mirrored star patterns none of the men had ever seen. Later, astronomers would identify them as alignments that would not be charted for another half-century. Then, from the depths of the satchel, she withdrew something wrapped tightly in decaying cloth, a small bundle that moved as if alive. As she unwrapped it, the men saw what could only be described as flesh that was still forming, pulsing softly as though breathing. Dr. Henley, trembling but compelled, stepped forward with the intent to drag Charlotte away from the circle, yet the instant his boot crossed the ashen boundary, he was thrown backward, screaming. Later, pale and shaking, he would insist that in that moment he had seen the history of the land itself, every birth, every death, every injustice layered upon that soil since time began. He said he understood then that Charlotte was not calling forth something evil but fulfilling an ancient debt. She was giving birth, he whispered, not to a child, but to everything that had been denied life. The shadows began to spin faster around her, creating a vortex of darkness that sucked in the very air. Theodore raised his pistol, weeping as he aimed it at his wife. Before he could pull the trigger, her eyes cleared, and for the briefest instant she looked at him with infinite sadness. "It's already done," she said, her voice echoing through every corner of the night. "The payment has been made, the land will have what it's owed." Her body convulsed violently, and from her belly came a sound that froze every man where he stood, the cry of a newborn child, multiplied into dozens of overlapping wails that harmonized like a terrible choir. The bundle in front of her began to grow rapidly, its form shifting through ages: infant, child, youth, then back again. The shadows surged inward, entering Charlotte's body and the bundle at once, merging light, blood, and darkness into one seething mass. The air screamed as reality bent around them. In desperation, Judge Treadwell hurled a flask of holy water toward the circle. When it struck the ground, steam erupted, and in that vapor the men saw visions of countless generations. Indigenous shamans, enslaved Africans, and white women across centuries performing fragments of the same ritual. Each had tried to repair what had been broken by conquest and cruelty. The truth hit them like thunder: this was no summoning but a reconciliation, a restoration of the land's memory. Then silence. The whirlwind vanished. Charlotte collapsed, the bundle before her taking the shape of a small child whose features shifted like ripples in water, black and white, old and young, male and female, all at once. The child rose unsteadily, its eyes ancient and knowing, and when it spoke, its voice carried every language the land had ever known. "I am the debt made flesh," it said. "I am the sorrow given form. I am what you owe and cannot repay." Theodore fell to his knees, sobbing as the child leaned close and whispered something that made him scream, as though his very spirit were torn open. Then, as dawn began to creep over the horizon, the thing dissolved into mist, leaving only Charlotte's unconscious body at the center of the circle, and the men standing years older than they had been when the night began. Charlotte was carried back to the house and laid upon her bed, her skin pale as linen, her pulse steady but faint, as though she existed somewhere between waking and death. For 3 days she did not stir, and during those 3 days the entire plantation seemed to fall under a strange enchantment. Every mirror in the mansion cracked at once, though no sound of shattering was heard. When examined, the lines in the glass were not random but formed intricate designs, maps and sigils resembling the routes of the Underground Railroad, years before such routes were ever documented. In Theodore's library, every book reordered itself on the shelves according to some logic unknown to man, alphabet and subject cast aside for a system that seemed to reflect emotion, grief beside guilt, confession beside redemption. Outside in the quarters, the enslaved people dreamed the same dream for 3 nights in a row, a child walking through the cabins, pressing its tiny hand against each door. In the dream, the handprints were wet with blood, yet no one felt fear. When they woke, they found that though the prints were gone, a strange awareness had settled into their minds. They knew names long forgotten, names of their ancestors, of children sold away, of brothers and mothers buried in unmarked graves. They could sense the locations of loved ones scattered across the South, and knew which of the overseers could be trusted, and which were plotting cruelty. It was as though the land itself had whispered its secrets into their bones. On the 3rd morning, Charlotte opened her eyes as though waking from a simple nap. She remembered nothing of the past months, nothing of the night of screams, of the pregnancy, of the ritual that had nearly consumed her. Dr. Henley examined her and found no trace that she had ever carried a child, though her body told a different story. Her anatomy bore signs of repeated childbirth, as though she had given birth dozens of times, not just once. Madame Arsenault was gone, her room stripped bare, the sheets untouched, no sign that she had ever existed. Even her name seemed to slip from memory. Theodore found he could no longer recall her face, only the echo of standing in the presence of something vast and inhuman wearing a woman's form. On December 30th, an old priest named Father Duchesne arrived from New Orleans, summoned by the stablemaster's desperate plea. He came too late to stop what had happened, but in time to witness what remained. His report, written in Latin and sealed away in Vatican archives, described not possession but reconciliation, a balancing of the spiritual ledger, as he called it. The land remembers every injustice, he wrote. When the weight of those memories becomes too great, it finds a vessel through which to speak. The events at the Bogard plantation were not evil, but inevitable, a forced acknowledgement of debts that could never be paid. Within a week, Theodore freed every enslaved person on his land, gifting them money and parcels of soil, a decision that made him a pariah among his peers. When asked why, he said only that he had seen the true cost of the world they had built and could no longer profit from its cruelty. The plantation began to unravel soon after. The sugarcane rotted on the stalk before harvest, blackening overnight with a stench of iron and decay. No buyer would touch the property. Those who tried to stay a night fled before morning, tormented by dreams of living entire lifetimes as the people who had suffered there. Yet within the Bogard home, an uneasy peace settled. Charlotte regained her strength and outwardly appeared serene, but she could no longer bear the dark. Every night, she demanded candles and oil lamps burning in every room, and if even one flame went out, she awoke screaming that the child in the shadows was calling her back. In daylight she was calm and gentle, but her eyes carried a quiet knowledge that unsettled those around her. She began to speak languages no one in Louisiana could understand: African dialects, French Creole, even indigenous tongues long extinct. She could walk the grounds and point to the exact spots where unmarked graves lay hidden. She wrote letters to strangers, guiding them to lost family members or stolen lands, always anonymously. In town, she would approach enslaved people and whisper words that seemed to fill them with invisible strength. They said afterward that when she spoke, something old and sacred stirred within them. Theodore, meanwhile, deteriorated into a kind of haunted madness. He continued his duties in the Senate, but his speeches grew erratic, filled with ideas his peers deemed lunacy, proposals for reparations, laws granting land to freed people, reforms that would not exist in America for another century. His colleagues whispered that he was possessed, yet the record of his bills would later seem prophetic. In his private journals, found after his death, he wrote of a child of sorrow, not flesh but idea, visiting him in dreams, showing him visions of what the South could have been if mercy had ruled instead of greed. The child grows stronger, he wrote. It walks in the minds of the guilty, sowing unrest, whispering of justice yet to come. It is the debt demanding remembrance. Charlotte spoke little of such things. She spent her remaining years quietly, a woman suspended between grace and horror, her eyes always searching the shadows for something only she could see. Yet despite her fears, there was peace in her final smile, as if she knew the reckoning was far from over, that what had begun on that cursed land was only the beginning of the memory the world would one day be forced to face. Professor Augustus Brenner never fully recovered from what he had witnessed, or rather, what he had failed to witness, at the gates of the Bogard plantation. After weeks of fever and delirium, he emerged with a new obsession: to understand what had taken place on that cursed soil and why it had chosen that family as its vessel. His research carried him across the South, through libraries, churches, and plantations where the air still smelled faintly of blood and sugar. What he found suggested that the events at Bogard were not an isolated tragedy, but part of something vast and deliberate, a web of secret workings that stretched across states and generations. Between 1845 and 1850, 17 plantations had reported incidents eerily similar to the Bogard affair: white women of education and unusual spiritual curiosity falling into trances, speaking in forgotten tongues, and performing rituals that merged African, indigenous, and European traditions. In each case, witnesses described lights, sounds, and manifestations that defied reason. And always, in the aftermath, there followed a shift, the sudden end of fevers that had ravaged entire regions, inexplicable deaths among overseers known for their cruelty, crops failing only on lands where blood had been spilled. It was as though the earth itself were exhaling after holding its breath for centuries. Brenner began to suspect that these women were connected, not by coincidence but by design, part of a network of hidden correspondences carried through letters, whispers, and coded journals passed among households where polite society's wives played roles more powerful than their husbands ever imagined. In his final notes, Brenner wrote that each ritual acted as a node in a greater spiritual circuit. And when the final node was activated at the Bogard plantation in December 1847, something fundamental shifted in the unseen architecture of the world. He called it the awakening of the land's memory. The plantation itself decayed rapidly after the incident. Within months, the sugarcane turned black before harvest, the stalks emitting a coppery stench that made workers gag. The soil beneath the keeping house refused to bear any crop. Animals avoided it entirely, circling wide around what locals soon called the remembering ground. Theodore Bogard, now a man haunted by visions and voices, tried desperately to sell the estate, but every prospective buyer fled after one night. Those who stayed until dawn reported dreams that felt longer than sleep, dreams in which they lived entire lives as the enslaved men and women who had once toiled there, their minds branded with memories they could not unsee. Some woke weeping, others left screaming. Word spread quickly, and the estate became an unspoken taboo. Yet from the ruin of one family rose a strange legacy. In 1852, 5 years after the night of the ritual, Charlotte gave birth again, a normal pregnancy this time, or so it seemed. The child, a boy named Gabriel, was born healthy, but from his first breath he seemed ancient. His eyes, deep and knowing, unnerved those who met them. As he grew, peculiar abilities revealed themselves. By touch alone he could sense the history of objects, who had held them, what griefs and joys they carried. He could speak languages after hearing only a few words, and he dreamed of places he had never been, describing them in perfect detail. Servants whispered that he spoke to invisible companions he called the shadow children, and Charlotte never scolded him for it. She only watched in silence, her face full of awe and sorrow. Gabriel's gift matured into purpose. As a young man, he vanished from the family estate and resurfaced years later in the abolitionist underground, working under aliases, providing information no one could explain how he possessed. He warned fugitives of patrol routes days before they were set, revealed hidden slave markets, and guided families through secret passages as if the land itself were whispering directions into his ear. Those who knew him said he moved like someone guided by hundreds of unseen hands. History would never record his name, yet the freedom of many bore his invisible signature. Charlotte aged quietly, her beauty fading into a kind of haunted grace. In her final years she often spoke to empty rooms, her voice soft as a lullaby. On August 15, 1859, exactly 12 years after the first night, she was found dead in her bed, a faint smile on her lips. The nuns who prepared her body discovered something extraordinary. Her skin bore faint markings, not scars or tattoos, but patterns formed from within her flesh, as though her body had become parchment for a story written in a dozen tongues. Under candlelight, the markings resolved into words, names and histories of people erased from records, enslaved children, women who had died in childbirth, men lost to the river's current. The nuns copied every line before the patterns faded with her last breath, preserving what became a catalogue of thousands of forgotten lives. They locked the manuscript in the archives of a New Orleans convent, where it remains, known only to a few scholars and priests who call it the Testament of Charlotte. Theodore lived 3 more years, his mind slipping between lucidity and madness. He spoke often of the child in the shadows, claiming it visited him in his dreams to show him futures that could never be futures where the South had chosen compassion over cruelty. Every debt is paid, he muttered before his death in 1862, though not always by those who owe it. When the Civil War consumed the region months later, his words returned to those who had known him, echoing like prophecy. The Bogard estate burned the following year in a fire that produced no heat, its ashes scattering across the fields that would grow nothing but wild red flowers each August and December. The plantation was gone, but its memory lingered, alive, restless, and waiting. After the fire that consumed the Bogard mansion, nothing remained but the stone foundations and the stories whispered among those who dared approach the land. Locals said the flames had burned cold, leaving behind no warmth, no smoke, only an ashen silence that seemed to hum faintly, like breath trapped beneath the soil. For a century nothing grew there except a single kind of flower, crimson and waxy, that bloomed only twice a year, on August 15th, the anniversary of the first night, and December 24th, the night of the ritual. Botanists who examined the blossoms could not identify the species. They concluded that the petals carried traces of iron, as though the flowers drank blood from the ground. People began calling them the children's blossoms, and no one dared to pick them. The land where the keeping house once stood became a pilgrimage site for the formerly enslaved and their descendants, a place they called the Remembering Ground. They came from miles away, standing in circles upon the blackened earth, whispering prayers and names long lost. Many claimed that when they stood there, they felt the presence of their ancestors pressing gently against the edge of memory. Some wept, others laughed through tears, saying they could hear music rising from the soil, voices harmonizing across centuries, not ghostly, but alive, defiant. In the decades that followed, Professor Brenner's final papers began to surface, discovered among his belongings after his death in 1871. Hidden within the fading ink was a chilling revelation. He had found evidence that what happened at the Bogard plantation had not been an ending, but a beginning. His research traced the descendants of those who had been present that night, the enslaved, the free people of color who had helped Marie Claire escape, and even the few surviving members of the Bogard line. Among them, he noted peculiar consistencies, vivid dreams of places they had never seen, uncanny intuition about danger, and an unshakable pull toward justice. He described these inheritors as children of shadow and memory, not supernatural beings but living conduits through which the unfinished work of the ritual continued to move. They are the quiet threads, he wrote, binding the tattered fabric of history together. He claimed to have corresponded with at least 5 other scholars investigating similar phenomena across the American South, all of whom died under strange or violent circumstances. One drowned in a flooded crypt beneath New Orleans. Another disappeared entirely while visiting ruins in Georgia. Brenner's notes ended abruptly, but his last words scrawled across the final page were clear. The children still walk. As the years passed, the world around the Bogard land changed. Slavery ended, the war was lost, and the South staggered toward a future built on the ashes of its own sins. Yet the memory of that place refused to fade. Farmers who attempted to cultivate the property reported impossible things: plows breaking against unseen stone, tools vanishing overnight, shadows flickering in daylight. One sharecropper claimed that when he struck his hoe into the soil, blood welled up instead of water. The state eventually seized the property, designating it barren and unfit for habitation. But even officials avoided it after sunset. Travelers passing along the nearby road spoke of seeing lanterns moving in the fields, as if dozens of people were gathering in silent procession. When investigators went to look, they found only trampled grass and the faint scent of magnolia and smoke. By the turn of the 20th century, folklore had replaced memory. Parents warned children not to wander near the old Bogard land, saying the ghosts there would steal their voices. Yet among black families in Baton Rouge, the story carried a different power. They told it not as a tale of fear but of inheritance, a reminder that their ancestors' pain had not vanished but transformed into strength. Grandmothers would whisper to children that the singing heard on humid summer nights was not haunting, but remembering. "Those are the ones who built the world," they'd say, "and the land makes sure we never forget them." Even the church could not fully ignore what lingered. In 1923, when the state attempted to develop the area for housing, surveyors uncovered a metal box buried deep beneath what had been the main house. Inside lay a document written in Charlotte Bogard's hand, dated August 14, 1847, the day before the first night. It was her confession, penned in calm, deliberate script, revealing that none of what had happened had been accidental. She described a network of women across the South, wives and daughters of plantation owners, secretly taught by enslaved midwives and healers. These women had recognized the spiritual wound inflicted by slavery, a wound that would one day destroy both the oppressor and the oppressed if left unhealed. They had conspired, over years of secrecy, to perform a collective working, to awaken the land and force the acknowledgement of the buried dead. "We do not do this from hatred," Charlotte wrote, "but because the future cannot be built upon forgotten graves. What we summon will not bring comfort but truth, and only through truth may the earth breathe again." Her final lines were both prophecy and warning. This is not the end. The children of shadow and sorrow will grow stronger with every generation. They will whisper in dreams, show the guilty their crimes, and bend the arc of history toward justice. The state quietly sealed the letter, yet word spread, carried by rumor and reverence alike. To some it was madness, to others the closest thing to a gospel the South had ever known. And so the Bogard plantation remained untouched, its soil restless but sacred, a reminder written in dust and blood. Those who passed by at night said they could hear faint singing, hymns blending with African chants and native prayers, weaving into one vast, mournful harmony. Some claimed that if you stood there long enough, you would begin to hear your own ancestors joining in, each voice part of the same eternal chorus. The land, it seemed, still remembered, and through that remembering, it continued to speak. Today, the site of the Bogard plantation lies silent and overgrown, a field the state owns but has never dared to develop. The roads that once led to its grand gates are now little more than dirt trails lined with oaks draped in heavy moss, their roots twisted deep into the bones of history. Locals still avoid the place after dark, though few can say exactly why. They only know that when the river runs slow and the air grows thick with humidity, strange lights drift above the ground, circles of faint gold and blue that move as though guided by unseen hands. Some claim to hear the distant hum of voices, hundreds layered together in perfect harmony, not mournful but resolute, like a prayer older than language. Those who have dared to step onto the land at night say that it feels alive beneath their feet, pulsing faintly, as if remembering each step that was ever taken upon it. The locals call it the field that breathes, and even the bravest whisper that to disturb its sleep is to wake something that has not forgotten. Among the descendants of those who once lived and labored there, the story of the Bogard plantation is not told as tragedy, but as revelation. They speak of dreams in which ancestors appear, not as ghosts bound to sorrow, but as living memories carrying messages, warnings, and blessings. Some children are said to be born with the mark, a faint spiral pattern on the skin that glows faintly under moonlight, and those marked are believed to hear the land whisper. These children, it is said, know things they could never have been taught. They hum the old songs without learning them, draw symbols in the dirt without understanding their meaning, and grow up with an unshakable sense that they are part of something larger than time. When asked where such knowledge comes from, they always answer the same: the ground remembers. Over the years, scholars and believers alike have tried to unearth proof of the events of 1847. Some insist it was hysteria, others that it was myth shaped by guilt and grief. Yet no one can explain the consistencies that persist through every generation. The unrecorded songs, the repeating patterns of the red blossoms, the dreams shared by people who have never met. Every attempt to build upon the land fails. Foundations sink, tools rust overnight, and surveyors report feeling watched, as if the soil itself were waiting for them to leave. Those who do not heed the warning fall ill, struck by fevers that no doctor can cure until they confess aloud that they should not have been there. And always, after such trespasses, the next rain washes away every trace of their intrusion, leaving the earth smooth and untouched once more. Modern historians who study the Bogard case rarely agree on its meaning. Some call it a psychological haunting, others a collective reckoning of conscience, But a few, those who read the hidden archives, the fragments of Charlotte's confession, the lost letters of Father Duchesne and Professor Brenner, say the truth is simpler and far older. They say the world itself keeps a record. Every cruelty, every act of mercy, every forgotten life becomes part of a memory too vast for any one person to hold. Sometimes, that memory seeks to balance itself. Sometimes it finds a voice. The Bogard Plantation, they claim, was not cursed but chosen, a place where centuries of unacknowledged suffering finally demanded to be heard. What was born that night in 1847 was not a monster, but a message, justice given form. The child in the shadows, as Theodore called it, was never meant to destroy but to remind. It was the living embodiment of history's debt, rising to ensure that nothing buried in silence would stay that way forever. Even now, those who stand on that ground and close their eyes say they can feel a presence there, gentle, watchful, and vast. Some hear footsteps, others the faint laughter of a child. And when the wind moves through the cane fields that have grown wild once more, it carries a rhythm like distant singing, a reminder of what the land itself once spoke. The story of the Bogard Plantation, with all its terror and beauty, remains unfinished because the memory it awakened still lingers, not just in Louisiana, but in every place where the earth bears witness to human sorrow. The land remembers, it always has, and through that remembering it keeps calling to us, not with anger, but with a quiet, enduring plea, to listen, to reckon, and to finally understand.